Now, it would be easy to say that beyond a calorie deficit or calorie balance or energy balance, whatever you want to call it, that nothing really matters when it comes to nutrition. That's kind of like the message that comes across, and I'm conscious that that sometimes might feel like the only message that you get. Now, that would not be entirely true. Obviously, energy balance matters most, especially when it comes to fat loss. Is energy balance is where it's at. If you haven't got the energy balance thing right, then you are not going to be making progress. Now, that doesn't mean to say that everything else is completely unimportant and you should never think about it. As I've said in many episodes of the show before, to me, nutrition is about layering all the different things that are important on top of solid foundations. So solid foundation might be your calorie deficit if you're trying to lose body fat. Then you might be saying, once I've got that bit nailed, I'm going to layer on thinking about my protein. Then you're going to start thinking about a minimum amount of fat, maybe some carbohydrate intake. Then you start thinking about sleep, food quality, fiber, all of those different sorts of things. Instead of trying to change everything all at once, all in one go, and thinking that you have to be this optimal being with optimal nutrition from minute one of deciding that you want to progress down this road, is kind of like, yeah, you don't really want to be doing that everything being changed all at once if you're not necessarily well tuned to that way of thinking, or you're kind of still trying to find your feet with it all. Thinking about layering on levels of importance as you go is a much easier way to think about it. Having said that, there are still things that are important and worth thinking about as you start to progress up that tree. Now, I'm prefacing this episode of the show with that because if you haven't got those basics nailed and you haven't got them consistently being done day after day, week after week, then do not skip to applying information within this episode of the show, thinking that you can compensate for not delivering on calories, protein, sleep, all those different sorts of things. You need to be building off solid foundations. So start looking at this stuff if you've got all of that other stuff in place. So if you have got energy balance spot on, you're losing weight, you're making progress, losing body fat, or you're building muscle, whatever it is, you've got your protein intake intact and you are, again, like building muscle or whatever it is, you have got your sleep routine done, so you've got like 7 to 9 hours sleep, and sleep is really good. You're managing hunger, you've got no issues with cravings. You're then looking at the quality of your food, so you're limiting processed foods, you're limiting refined sugar, you're optimizing for fiber, for gut health, all of these different sorts of things. You've got all of that going on. Maybe even you've thrown in the right supplements into the equation. Now you want to be looking at maybe something around timing of food. Maybe. Again, depending on your goal. But don't feel like it's, this is some sort of magical thing of it. He's going to tell us about carb timing. Carb timing is really going to be the silver bullet that I'm looking for. I can skip all that other bullshit because changing my sleep routine, changing my sleep pattern is too much like hard fucking work. So if I skip to this carb timing thing that he's talking about, then that's going to be really, really going to make the difference. It fucking ain't. You're really talking about like the cherry and the icing on top of the cake. But if you haven't got a good fucking cake and you're just putting cherries on shit, then actually maybe you've got bigger things to worry about, like eating shit cake, for one. So that aside, let's look at carb timing and what actually does matter and what's a strategy you can start to implement so that you can get some benefit from carb timing. Now, the first thing I would always say is fuel for the activity. Now, many of you will be doing lots of different sports, different training, all sorts of different things. You might be a cyclist, a runner, marathon runner, triathlete, cyclist. You might be a resistance trainer. You might be a power lifter. All of these things require different amounts of energy for one, and to a different intensity. They might require different macronutrient setup to be optimal to fuel for that activity. So I'm not going to be able to give you a one size fits all for all of those different possible scenarios. So you've got to try and figure out, okay, well, for me doing this is what my training looks like. This is going to be optimal in my environment. So fuel for the activity. Now, I would always say ensure you're consuming adequate carbohydrate prior to that training session. Now, again, that's going to depend on what activity you're doing, when you're doing it. For example, if you are someone who resistance trains first thing in the morning, then you're probably not going to have optimal carbohydrate intake if it is an hour after you've trained. It's probably not optimal at that stage. You might want to think about having calories slightly later into the evening so that come the following morning, you have got a full suite of carbs, let's say, to call on and to use within that training. If, however, you are training later in the afternoon, then again, you can have a different carbohydrate timing. It depends on the activity, depends on the person, and it depends at what time you are doing it. But fundamentally, fuel for the activity, fuel for the training that you're doing or the sport, the competition that you're involved in, making sure that you've got adequate energy, adequate carbohydrate to fuel that specific event or that specific task that you want to do. Now, there's this whole thing about high GI carbs post-workout. Now, you'll hear people say that you need to have high GI carbs so that they can act as like the train that's going to deliver the protein into the muscles by spiking insulin, and then the insulin's going to be driving all the protein into the muscle cells. So therefore you need something that spikes insulin high, which is going to be high GI carb, and therefore you're going to have people recommending you have things like cereal, high sugar cereal. So that's going to be like all these protein amino acids. Think about the cereal is like the gain train, and then the amino acids are hopping on the train of the carriage and the cereal is shuttling them to your muscles. That's how it's going to work, right? Yeah, nah, not quite. So you could have cereal post-workout. I sometimes enjoy a little bit of cereal post-workout, but it's not necessarily because I think that it's some sort of fucking gain choo-choo train that's going to deliver my amino acids into those muscle cells. That's not really how it works. Now, again, I'm going to make a wild assumption here that most of you listening and watching this are going to be having whey protein shakes post-workout. It's kind of the norm. It's neither good nor bad. It's probably slightly more beneficial if you're taking things down to the nth degree to do so, but not essential to make gains and to make progress. But I'm going to assume, because it's so synonymous with weight training and that's effectively where my wheelhouse is, I'm going to assume that you are doing that. Now, if you are doing that, whey protein is sufficiently insulinemic in order to have that, let's call it the gain train shit happening post-workout. So it's not just carbohydrate that is going to spike insulin that helps deliver, if we want to use that phrase, your amino acid into your muscle cells. The whey protein itself is sufficiently insulinemic to have that response as well. So protein alone will have the right response. You don't need the high GI carbs. Then some people might say, well, it's for glycogen replenishment. It's going to replenish my glycogen stores. Now, that's true. Carbohydrate at that point will replenish your glycogen stores. The question is, do you need it to? And the answer is probably not. Now, you might say, well, okay, if I am training later that day, so maybe I'm doing 2 training sessions. Maybe you are a rugby player who you do your weights workout in the morning and you do rugby training in the evening. It would therefore, in those scenarios, make sense for you to have some form of high GI carbs to replenish that glycogen quickly so that you can perform again later in the day. If, however, you are like most people who over a 24-hour period, you're only going to train the once and it's going to be, let's say, for argument's sake, a resistance training session, then the nutrition that you have over that 24-hour period post-workout is going to be sufficient to replenish glycogen. It's not this race to replenish glycogen as quickly as possible for most people. However, we always love a little bit of a posh but. However, it might make sense to have some carbs around that workout period. Now, that is because of this non-insulin dependent glucose uptake or disposal. Now, that's a posh way of thinking about various different things, but there is some marginal benefit potentially for you to do that. So think about that if you want to. Again, it's probably going to come down to adherence and what you find works for you. The third thing to think about is something called carbohydrate bunching, which is a phrase that I will be openly admitting I've stolen from MNU, Mac Nutrition Uni. So let's credit them where credit's due. Carbohydrate bunching. Now this is about what it says on the tin, bunching carbohydrate at specific points in the day. Now there's lots of research in terms of, having carbohydrates early in the morning, having carbohydrates in the evening, having carbohydrates spread out in terms of multiple different meals, or just having one meal, 2 meals. There's lots of different research out there looking at these various different things. And carbohydrate bunching of some description may help with metabolic health. And having periods of the day where you have either low or no carbs may be advantageous, but that works at any point in the day. Now, it doesn't matter if you're intermittent fasting and therefore sort of backloading. It doesn't matter if you're a breakfast eater and you're kind of front loading. Both scenarios work, but kind of bunching carbs, or the majority, you don't have to be all of the carbs you have, but bunching a good proportion of your carbs so that during the day there are periods of time where you're having low or no carbohydrates appears to have some small but statistically significant impact on your body composition. Now, the mechanisms of why that might be the case aren't exactly 100% clear. It might be to do something with like nutrient partitioning. It could be like metabolic flexibility. It could be that if you have like larger meals but less frequent, there might be a small thermic effect benefit. So the calories needed to digest and absorb a bigger meal might be greater than to absorb a smaller meal. But in the research that you can look at, that difference in one particular study was only about 16 calories, and freaking squeezing out one small size poo would probably take 16 calories or even more. So we're talking about negligible differences here. There also is the element of adherence. So for example, intermittent fasting might help you adhere to your calorie deficit better. It might be that you are a habitual breakfast eater. So again, having more carbohydrates around there might just help you feel better and make you more satisfied and more adherent to your diet. So there's all these different things to think about, but we do know that carbohydrate bunching of some description at some point in the day might have this small but significant benefit. Now again, I'll come back right to the beginning and say, if you haven't got the other things done, you are talking about minuscule benefits, marginal gains, before you've addressed the fundamental principles that you need to get right first. So don't let that slip out of your brain. Now, the other reason why some of this carbohydrate bunching or carbohydrate timing might be beneficial is if you're not tracking calories, you're doing no calorie tracking whatsoever, you're just managing food a little bit more, let's call it, I don't want to use the word intuitive, but let's say you're just managing it on basically how you feel or whatever. Now, in that sort of scenario, eating within your what we call circadian rhythms might actually be beneficial. Now, your circadian rhythms are to do with like night and day and things like that, and the natural internal body clock. So if you are having your food at specific times of the day that are in keeping with that circadian rhythm, i.e. you're having potentially more carbohydrates or even just more calories earlier in the day in those daylight hours, so for example in sort of breakfast time, and less in the evening, that might be more naturally in line with your circadian rhythm, and therefore that might make it easier to stick to your diet in a non-tracking environment. Obviously, if you're tracking and you can stick to it whenever, then it kind of doesn't really matter. So really all this boils down to, in terms of carbohydrate timing, adherence and preference. They're the two key things to get right. So what way of setting up your diet can you adhere to, and what's your preferred choice of making sure that your nutrition is optimal? If you can't satisfy those two things, then the rest of it doesn't matter. If you can't adhere to it and it's not your preferred choice, then okay, you can't adhere to it, so you're not going to stick to it for very long. If you don't prefer it, you might stick to it for a bit, but in the future, maybe not so much. So get those points right. Then think about, right, okay, what are the tweaks and adjustments that I can make maybe to carbohydrate timing in this instant within that framework that I've already created? What can I do to optimize my training performance? So what tweak am I going to make to fuel for the activity? Then you might want to look at basically your post-workout nutrition or the nutrition around that workout. Again, how can you optimize that to suit the goal, to suit preferences, and to suit adherence? And then you might think about carbohydrate bunching. So is there a point of within the day, anywhere within that day, be it morning or night or whatever, that you can bunch carbohydrates or the majority of your carbohydrates to get that small but significant metabolic benefit? That's where I would start with carbohydrate timing and adjusting things. But again, I will zoom you right back to the beginning and make sure that you have got that take-home point that you need to build this off solid foundations. If you are skipping energy balance, protein, macros, sleep, food quality, fiber, all of these different sorts of things. If you are skipping those things to get to carbohydrate timing, you are doing it fucking wrong. Get back to square one, get those things right, then build this on top. So hopefully this gave you a little bit of an insight into carbohydrate timing and some of the things you want to think about in the future when you've got those foundations in place.